Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. On this week's podcast, Heather Baker of Public Consulting Group joins us on the 5th anniversary of the Family First Prevention Services Act to discuss the law's finer points, what conversations states are having about this law today, and much more. It's a pretty wonky conversation in that we're talking a lot about the kind of nitty-gritty of the Family First Act and how it is or isn't working. But obviously I'm biased. I was part of the conversation. I think it is worth it if you want to hear from somebody that's often in the room in conversation with states and working with them on the best way to implement it. So I'll run through a few headlines before we get to that interview because it was kind of long. But first, just a quick plug for some great online events that we have coming up for listeners who are interested in all things New York. If you are listening to this podcast on the day that it came out, there's still maybe some time for you to register for our event today, Monday, March 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, called Mental Health at the Crossroads, How New York's Community Mental Health Barriers Lead to Family Separation. So New York is being sued over its lack of community-based mental health supports for youth. You can join us for a conversation about that lawsuit, what community health means, and to discuss the connection between these challenges around community-based mental health and the state's juvenile justice and child welfare system. Joined by Sandy Santana, who's the Executive Director of Children's Rights, and then Jose Perez and Amal Karoufi, both who are involved with the Youth Empower program at Children's Defense Fund New York. And yours truly will be moderating that discussion. If you hear this after the fact, fear not, we will eventually post that on our YouTube page for Fostering Media Connections and probably sneak it into the podcast rotation as well. And then our other upcoming New York event on March 23rd, plenty of time still to register for this. It is from our Youth Voices Rising program entitled Under Construction, Policies That Shape the New York Child Welfare System. So the panelists, all with lived experience in New York foster care, will join our Youth Voices Rising team to talk about whether recent reforms of both juvenile justice and child welfare, in particular the Raise the Age state reforms of juvenile justice and then the Family First Prevention Services Act, which we're going to talk on the podcast today about, have improved things for youth in the state's foster care system. So I will post registration links for both of those events in the show notes for this episode. You should definitely check those out. And again, if you miss them or cannot make them in person, you should just register anyway. We will send you the recording and then eventually we'll get up for free on our various social media and YouTube accounts. All right, let's do some headlines for the week. We did go for about an hour with Heather Baker talking about the Family First Act, so I will keep this somewhat brief, but there is a whole bunch of great journalism that our folks here at the Imprint have produced over the last few weeks that I wanted to make sure people knew about. So let me start there, and we're going to start in Texas. So there are more than 20,000 foster youth in Texas, and a small but significant fraction of them will turn 18 in the system. And like many states, Texas has amassed a so-called extended foster care program to help lengthen the runway for youth who turn 18 so that they can remain in care into their adult years through the age of 21. But an investigation by the Imprint that was led by reporters Sandy West and Jeremy Loudenbeck unearthed a complex process for extended care that really throws significant hurdles up to connecting youth with housing, particularly the most sought-after option by youth, which is supervised independent living, as opposed to group homes or residential care programs and foster homes. Those are the options and generally the placements that youth in foster care experience during their adolescent years. So it stands to reason it's not exactly something they're psyched to pursue from 18 to 21. The supervised independent living offers a lot more freedom to them. So as the reporters relay in this story, just as one anecdote that they lead off with, one young woman who had turned 18 in foster care was begging to get into some place to live, with workers telling her they really couldn't help because of her own circumstances. She ended up in a domestic violence shelter, and then later was sleeping in a graveyard with a boyfriend. And at the time that happened, there were 91 supervised independent living beds open in the state. And that is a fact that her attorney, the young woman's attorney, found out from us in the course of reporting this, which you can see from the story if you read it. She was none too pleased by that. Some really great visuals to go along with this story that really show the difference between Texas and some of the other very large states in terms of what their extended foster care population looks like as a percentage of, all kids in care, but then also how many eligible young adults choose to remain in extended foster care. It's just on that first part, as I mentioned, there's about 28,000 youth in foster care in Texas, 667 in extended care. Florida, probably the next largest foster care system. California is bigger than all of these. Preference for that. They have 23,000 youth in care and about 1,500 in extended foster care. Only about 27% of eligible young adults in Texas end up in extended foster care. That's what the state data showed. Just by contrast, in California, which is obviously a huge state with a very, very large child welfare system and more foster youth in it than any state, 85% of eligible 18 to 21-year-old foster youth are served. So the findings that we presented to people for reaction really frustrated some judges and attorneys who reviewed them. I expect there might be some more news on this coming. We'll continue to stay on this issue, and we'll update the podcast if we produce some more news on it. But in the meantime, I will definitely include the link to the story in our show notes. All right, Imprint story number 2 to highlight. This was about 2 weeks ago. We concluded Sylvia A. Harvey's terrific 3-part series on Cordell Miller, who as a teenager was incarcerated and sentenced to a lengthy term for murder. In part 1 of this series, Harvey reports on the homelessness and abuse Miller experienced as a child. In part 2, Harvey covers his chance at a life outside of the prison walls thanks to a so-called second look law in Washington, D.C. That's where he was arrested and ultimately convicted. The second look law is a legislative strategy that has gained traction across the country to ensure that young people who are arrested for very serious crimes and end up in adult court or adult prison have a meaningful opportunity at release at some point in their lives. And then in the final installment of the 3-part series, Harvey covers how Miller receives his second chance at freedom, but not in the United States. She follows Miller's story as he experiences deportation and then reconnects with a country that he had left a long time ago. So I will, again, I don't know, I always feel the need to say this, but I will drop a link to the story in the show notes for the episode. Last one to kind of highlight out of the last few weeks on the Imprint is Colleen Connolly's piece about the fact that years after federal efforts to force better attention to school stability for youth in foster care, there is still a major struggle on this issue for most states. Just by way of an example that Connolly writes about, Nevaeh Brewer, who's now 21, experienced some educational hardships in the state of Washington. She entered foster care as an 11-year-old and told Connolly that she has moved between foster homes and group homes dozens of times, just through an ever-shifting series of middle and high schools. And here's a comment she related to Connolly for the story. I'm at one school and we're on chapter 1. I go to another school and they're on chapter 4. It's really hard because there's all this instability. And then you go to school and you're like, I have no clue what you're talking about. So definitely go and read the full story to get a sense of what states are and aren't doing. But just as quick context, when Connolly says in the story that, this is something that Congress has aimed to fix, just a quick history of this. Obviously, a major issue for educational stability for foster youth is that they are moving around from place to place, and it's either not in their interests or in the past it has been inconvenient for foster parents. They change schools a lot instead of just keeping their school of origin. So in the Fostering Connections Act, way back now in 2008, President George W. Bush signed, there were efforts to ensure that children had the opportunity to remain in their school of origin. But the problem was that really only applied because it was essentially child welfare legislation to instructing the child welfare agencies to do that. Didn't really have any sort of authority or, instruction to local school districts, which obviously operate the schools, but then they also are the ones who contract to transport kids to school, and transportation is a major, major part of this. You cannot ensure school of origin if you don't have a way for a youth, for example, who's living maybe 10, 15 miles outside of a school district to get transported into their school of origin if that's what they want. And the system feels is in their best interest to remain in that school. So what happened next, several years later, is it was time to rewrite the sort of overarching major piece of federal legislation around education, which before that rewrite was kind of known as No Child Left Behind Act. Now, thanks to that sort of reauthorization, is the Every Student Succeeds Act. And I believe led by Senator Al Franken at the time, along with some other legislators, included a provision that sort of tried to tie the school districts into the school of origin expectations. So where fostering connections required the child welfare agencies to focus on and offer a school of origin, guarantee to foster youth whenever possible. This new Every Student Succeed Act basically had the same instruction to the schools, but they left one thing open. Well, first off, they required that states essentially submit a plan that demonstrated they knew what they were doing. They had a plan to make sure that kids could be transported when they needed to be. And what I think, Connolly describes in the story, and as we've reported on in the past, is it's not entirely clear first, how many states have developed those plans and if they're following them. But even in a good plan, they left kind of something open, and that is how to decide who pays for the transportation. So it's not exactly specified in the Every Student Succeeds Act. If there's a question about the cost and who's going to pay for it between the child welfare agency and the school, the federal legislation at least leaves no definitive, tie goes to the runner in one direction to the other sort of instruction. It just kind of leaves it open, which was always, I felt, kind of a loophole that was sitting there waiting to be used. So anyway, read the full story to get caught up on that one. The last sad piece of news to share for this month, and then we'll move on to our guest interview. Senator Jim Abourezk, who was a staunch supporter of tribes and shepherded the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act, died on February 24th, which was his 92nd birthday. So Abourezk was the first Arab American to serve in the United States Senate. His parents emigrated to America from Lebanon, and they ended up settling in the Rosebud Indian Reservation, which is located within the state of South Dakota. So Abourezk represented South Dakota in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate in the 1970s. He was instrumental in carrying out a 5-year study that was conducted on family separation within the Native American community that found as many as 1/3 of Native children were being taken into foster care. Nearly all of them were placed either with non-Native foster or adoptive families and permanently severed from their tribal communities. That study was crucial to developing the argument and the construct for the Indian Child Welfare Act, which, again, Abourezk was kind of crucial in authoring and championing and moving through Congress. Indian Child Welfare Act, as anybody who's listening to this podcast knows, is sort of up for constitutional debate right now with the United States Supreme Court. They heard arguments around the constitutionality of ICWA in November as part of a case called Brackeen v. Holland, and the decision around that case is expected sometime this summer. All right, when we come back, we'll talk about the first 5 years of the Family First Act with Heather Baker.
Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making, and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/child welfare.
We are joined today by Heather Baker, a manager at the Public Consulting Group overseeing child and family services, which Public Consulting Group advises and consults estates all over the country on a lot of stuff, including child welfare. So Heather is in the unique position of having heard from lots of states about their experiences with the Family First Prevention Services Act. We're going to talk today about some various parts of the law, what she sees states trying to figure out still, what's gone well, what people are struggling with. So without further ado, Heather, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
Let's let them get to know you a bit. You got to give me one of these favorites. You can give me more if you want. Categories are TV show, movie, sports team, musical group, and book. Heather Baker, what do you got?
I have a TV show that I am watching right now, so I have some recency bias in my pick. Slow Horses on Apple, I think it is. And I like it because it's about spies, like British spies, and they are all assigned to a unit because they made mistakes. And it took me a while to figure it out, but they still make a lot of mistakes. And I like that. I like a spy show. It's not like played for laughs, but when you start to notice that they're maybe not like super great spies, it's more interesting.
It is a really funny show. I love that you found the deeper subtextual meaning that may have something to do with what we're going to talk about and all that. Okay, so we are going to proceed a little bit under the assumption that listeners have some working knowledge of the Family First Act. Full name, Family First Prevention Services Act. No one calls it that. Family First Act and what it does. But if you are coming in for the cold, I'm going to link in our show notes to the Imprint's Big Explainer series we put out on this, and also the American Academy of Pediatrics. Really great guide on this. But just a very short Cliff Notes version before we get into all this. The Family First Act was passed 5 years ago. The two biggest provisions are altering what's called the Title IV-E entitlement, which heretofore was largely used to pay for foster care and adoption under the Family First Act. On the front end of that, states can submit a plan to use some of their 4E money and draw down federal dollars to spend on preventing foster care. And then on the back end of the law, there are now new limits on the extent to which states can draw federal money to pay for what's called congregate care. That's group homes, institutions, res care, things like that. We'll get into some details about other stuff too, but that's the kind of the broad strokes. Heather, anything else you need to add before we can talk? Is that about it?
No, that's the big stuff. Yeah.
Okay. And kinship navigators, which we'll also get to. So let's start real big picture with just how much uptake there has been, because while the limits on the congregate care took effect for every state in 2021, it is up to a state whether they want to participate and submit a plan and get approved to use federal dollars to try and prevent foster care. So according to I checked the HHS tracker on this today. I try to check it every week. I believe we're at 38 states that have been approved. 11 are in the kind of submission process. I may be folding in DC and a couple tribes into that, because at the end of the day, right now, there's only 6 states that have not even submitted. And actually, one of those was Alaska, which I think did, and then got it kicked back or something. You probably know more about that than I do. Okay, so that's sort of the big picture, is that the majority of states have had their plan approved. That said, it seems kind of from the HHS financial reports that most states have really not drawn down any money yet. Like, there's very few that have. So what's your kind of sense on where we stand with participation in the foster care prevention piece? Like, is it about where you expected it to be? Has it kind of exceeded your expectation for the 5-year mark?
I think I would say if you had asked me 5 years ago where we would be at, I definitely would have hoped that states were more in a better position to access the funding. I mean, Family First at its very core is a funding change. So the levers that the feds are using to shift practice towards the prevention of placement into foster care, towards kinship, away from excessive use of congregate care, they're all financial. It's all through funding from Title IV. So it's disappointing, I think, that we haven't seen significant federal revenue going to states from the prevention side of things. There are definitely a couple of states who are accessing funds at a much faster rate than other states. And I think a lot of that goes back to how states have really approached the prevention program, for the 38 states that are approved in 38 different ways, right? So the early states, some of them had prevention services already in place and were able to quickly put together a federally approvable prevention services plan based on what they were already spending money on and already had sort of supports in place to expand contracts or to make additional investments into. And I think the advantage in that case is that they were able to spend a little bit more time on the mechanics of drawing the funds, because Title 40 is a very, very complicated funding source. And Family First, while certainly a step in the right direction in terms of investing federal funds in prevention services and moving federal funding further upstream, which hadn't happened in a significant way before, although there certainly are other funding sources that do that. That's good, but it didn't make any of the existing rules for accessing Title 40 any easier either. So it gave us tons of new rules, and it didn't alleviate any of the challenges of the existing programs, which already had tons and tons of rules.
Well, I would say, let me push back just one.
Yeah.
It seems to me that it's pretty significant that they dropped the income eligibility. That's a pretty big difference in foster care. Or am I wrong about that?
The income eligibility for foster care is very much still in place.
Oh, but I guess what I'm saying is for the prevention services, I'm totally misunderstanding. They don't have to. You can do those services with any child. That's
correct.
What we're going to talk about next.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. They did not add an eligibility requirement for the new program, the prevention services program, related to financial eligibility. So that's true. Yeah. They didn't add that new rule. They did add an eligibility process that requires a child to be identified as a candidate, that the child has a prevention services plan, and that the services that the Title 40 prevention services are listed in the prevention plan as a strategy to prevent placement. So there's still a lot of things that a worker has to do and a lot of documentation that the state has to maintain to be able to make a child eligible for prevention.
Yeah. We're going to talk about that next. Just a couple quick observations on sort of where we are with states participating. One thing that I guess I would see some optimism in is I think of, the last round of sort of like opt-in things on child welfare were in the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act, extending foster care, kinship guardianship arrangements. Yeah, I covered that. And my recollection was that, first, like after 5 years, very few, particularly with the extended foster care, very few states had kind of even gone and sought permission and tried to connect themselves to that. So just that level of like, we are going to get in the pipeline. I think we're in a different moment there with states are just going to avail themselves of potentially doing that more so than everybody was kind of wary on the extended. But that doesn't mean, like you said, the money talks at the end of the day. If everybody's eligible, but nobody's taking money, I don't know how much, the law made a difference on that, right? I mean, that's really the test.
The mechanics, I think, is where I would say are really hard. You have to, in order to claim for a prevention service, you have to know that a child received it. You have to know how much it cost, and those are kinds of things that it seems like, well, obviously the states should know that. A lot of these kinds of prevention services contracts were constructed in a way that gave community-based providers a lot of flexibility in which services they were giving to which families at what time, and didn't require a lot of reporting back to the state. And so it is part of the planning process is thinking from a policy perspective, what do we want to fund? What are the outcomes that we want to get? Where do we want to focus our fidelity monitoring and continuous quality improvement and evaluation very heavily on the policy side? And there is also all of these pieces just around, how do you buy the service? How does the provider report their costs? How do you know who's benefiting from the service? And I think those are the pieces. How is your child welfare information system set up to ensure that all these requirements are met that inform your ability to claim? Those are the pieces that I think are requiring a lot of catching up.
Right. Yeah. And that all comes after the process of deciding, as you kind of alluded to earlier, who in the youth population are eligible to get these services. So like we were talking about, foster care is kind of gate kept in terms of what the feds will pay for by a very out of date. I mean, no one debates that. It's a very out of date income standard, tied to the parents' income. That is not the case with Family First, but there still are these things at the front end. So it's not tied to income, but the limit, the kind of big picture one, is that they must be considered a candidate for foster care, which sort of bank shot involves a determination written on paper that the child is at imminent risk of removal. So the clear intent of the legislators was to kind of position Family First as this but-for scenario. That's how I read the letter of the law, is like, without these services, but for these services, foster care would be necessary in this case, and because of them, it isn't. So beyond that, imminent risk wasn't really defined in the law, and then the federal child welfare officials at the time really kind of encouraged states to go ahead and take a pretty broad interpretation of that term if they wanted to. So this is a big deal because it obviously determines how people can get services in a family setting. What do you see on this? Like, is there wide variation in how states ended up defining this? Are they having a hard time settling on things and getting them cleared?
Yeah, one of the very first conversations, even between 2016, when we thought the legislation was going to be passed, and 2018, when it was kind of surprisingly passed, was around what is a candidate? Right. And that's always been a question because the candidacy had existed in 4A policy before that, just not with regards to paying for services. And there were a lot of early conversations from states that wanted to go very quickly into expanding the definition of a candidate to include children who were not yet known to the child welfare system. So typically, we think of a child as being at risk of placement into foster care after a hotline call has been made. And there were a lot of states and a lot of sort of federal encouragement at the time to think beyond the children who are known to the child welfare system and think about how could we expand the reach of Family First into the community. This imminent risk requirement has been a challenge. Part of the reason it's a challenge is that the law doesn't, in my opinion, has an internal contradiction because it says to be a recipient of a service, you have to be at imminent risk of placement into foster care. And I think historically we've understood that to mean the way that you've described it, John, that absent prevention services, this child will be placed into foster care, meaning that the risk is at hand, that the risk is imminent. At any moment, foster care could be the outcome for this child. But in the description of the kind of services that can be paid for by Title IV prevention and provided to these children, the law says that the services need to show outcomes that demonstrate the prevention of abuse and neglect and reducing the likelihood of placement into foster care. And those things are different. So we end up with a lot of states thinking about, well, wait a minute, like how could we define candidacy in a way that aligns more with the kinds of services that are funded and less with this imminent risk definition, because otherwise the law contradicts itself in a way that makes its application so narrow as to maybe not even provide a financial incentive to move forward with prevention. So that conversation was live and happening from the very beginning. And some states early went in to try to define some populations that would be outside of the traditional imminent risk population and submitted definitions of candidacy that were more expansive in their prevention services plans. The way that the feds have responded to that, I think, has varied from region to region. I know that, or I believe that Children's Bureau has been trying to have consistent messages from region to region, but I think it's just really hard. The regional folks are reading what the law says. It says imminent risk of placement. They have an understanding of what that means, and trying to move them along and approving plans that allow for a more expansive definition of candidacy. And this is a little bit of a fine point, don't necessarily require that every single child has those words written in their case, that this child is at imminent risk for placement into foster care.
So you think that that's a very big deal? The act simply of stating that about a child for what reason? For future potential engagement with the child welfare system? Like that might doom a child or a family to deeper involvement later?
I don't know. I say sometimes, like, just writing down that a child's at imminent risk of placement into foster care can increase that child's risk of placement into foster care. Especially if the possibility that a child, based on all of the current circumstances, could be placed into foster care tomorrow is very, very low, which is, I think, the population that we're talking about. It is the population that these practices that have been approved on the clearinghouse are intended to serve. In-home family support programs, home visiting programs are not designed for families that need immediate crisis intervention. They are child abuse and neglect prevention programs, and they are approved on the clearinghouse, Parents as Teachers, Healthy Families America. That's not to say that they couldn't be applied in crisis situations, but that's not the larger intent of those programs. And yet they are approved on the clearinghouse. So we should be able to use those, right? And I think the challenge is if the federal oversight requires a state to say, this child at imminent risk of placement into foster care because they need a service that is intended to prevent abuse and neglect. That's not quite right. And I would urge a view that would say that states could define in their Title 4 Prevention Services Plan that receives federal approval for the entire state, what categories of children are at imminent risk of placement into foster care by that, federal, to use those federal words, but then to never have to actually associate these words with an individual case. That's what I would hope we could get to in terms of reconciling the fact that the law in and of itself has this contradiction.
Interesting. Do you think that in general, the instruction for states to define this entirely on their own is a good one? Or do you think we'd be better off with sort of what the feds usually do, which is to say, this is for sure imminent risk, and then you can feel free to go beyond that if you want? Like, we'd be better off if they had tried to take a crack at that?
I think that the approach that the Children's Bureau took, while frustrating to states, was probably the best approach in being able to have more flexibility. We see this in other programs that are not quite as prescriptive as the Title 4 Prevention Services Program. In your TANF state plan, for example, you have 4 goals. You can demonstrate that service aligns with one of the goals, and then you can pay for it with TANF. So there's not a lot of prescription coming from the feds on what's in and what's out, unless that guidance is requested. And so I personally think that states are better situated when the feds allow for more flexible state-specific responses that can make the planning process and the approval process more challenging.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the Imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
So let's talk about these services. We've been talking about the framework that they go in. One important caveat of Family First is that this is not a situation where you get approved and then you just get to pick any service you want. The only services that can be paid for and the only ones that states can even apply to get approved for are the ones that this clearinghouse that was created review and find to be of strong enough evidence that, they get added to the list. So what has surprised you about the approval so far, and what do you see most states gravitating for? Let's start there. What do you see the most states embracing off the list?
Well, we see a lot of plans that include services that were deemed as well supported because there's a requirement in the law that was kind of loosened up between 2020 and 2024 that 50% of the services that you claim for prevention have to be in this well-supported category. We see a lot of state plans listing well-supported practices. So that includes things like FFT, family-focused treatment, multisystemic treatment, parent-child interaction therapy, the services, a nurse-family partnership, Healthy Families America, Parents as Teachers. These are programs that we see popping up on more state plans because they fall into that well-supported category. And in a lot of places, they're already in place in the state prior to Family First. And then we also see the kinds of services, the in-home family support services that are intended to be provided in a larger crisis situation, like real family crisis stabilization services. Those are services like family-centered treatment, home builders, START, Intercept. Those are services where the intervention is immediate. And so we see some uptake on those. I think where I'm really excited about motivational interviewing, that we are seeing across a lot of states. It is a well-supported practice.
I feel like I've seen that on more plans than anything.
I haven't done the count, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
And part of the reason, a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's a well-supported practice and people generally find it to have a lot of promise in child welfare and shifting the power dynamic in a caseworker's relationship with the family. Motivational interviewing is a service where the practitioner is actively listening, asking a lot of questions, and where the objective is to bring a person who's feeling kind of ambivalent about two different choices into a mindset where they're ready to change. And a lot of the way that people talk about this application in child welfare is to make that relationship less punitive, to reduce the amount of surveillance, and really put more power in the parents' hands around what they want to change and how are they going to go about changing it, and really teaching caseworkers to listen to the person who's having the experience at that very moment. We talk about listening to people with lived experience in developing policy, and that's very, very important and has been something that has family sort of the focus on lived experience, I think, and amplifying voices of people who have actually experienced the child welfare system has increased over the last 5 years as we've been implementing Family First. And I don't know if that's causal or correlative or just happenstance, but it's really good as all of these policy decisions are being made. But I think motivational interviewing is also a way to say, also listen to the people who you're working with right now. Listen to what they're actually saying about their future. So I'm very excited about motivational interviewing. And it's one of those services, it's a case management service. So as long as the child and family has an active case with the child welfare agency, they are receiving a Family First service. And that helps on the claiming side. It helps with the money.
So as you said, like when this law started out, the rule was that of whatever you submitted in your plan to get approved to do foster care prevention services, you had to 50% of what you ended up spending with your federal, reimbursement was for these well-supported tier. And they relaxed that. So that's a built-in reason to gravitate more towards them, obviously. I think the other reason to do it is because you don't need to do much, it seems, to continue evaluating those versus the other tiers. Supported is one of them, promising is the other, which I think is a little, I don't call it insidious, but it's a problem because our best bet to actually study the implementation of services in more places with more diverse groups of people is if states pick them up and have to evaluate how they go. And if they're not going to do that because they're afraid to add them to the list for whatever reason, or because it's going to cost them a lot, that seems like problematic. Do you see states struggling with that? Like, is that a cost benefit analysis where they're kind of saying, I don't want to add this because I don't know how much it's going to end up costing us to evaluate it?
Definitely the fact that Children's Bureau allowed states to waive the evaluation requirement for well-supported practice, I think definitely increased the attractiveness of those practices because evaluations are, do cost money. We still see a lot of promising and supported practices and plans. I also caution against doing too much at one time. And so having a supported practice or a promising practice in your plan and doing an evaluation, I think does increase the evidence base. There's value to that. Making it so you're not doing 10 of those at the same time also might be good to sort of limit the amount of implementation that you're having to support and be able to do it well. I would also say one thing I don't want to lose track of or sight of is that there are so many practices and interventions that states and local communities are engaged in that are not on the clearinghouse and probably never will be. And there's a whole host of reasons for that. They can be community-based services that are so broad in how they're used and in terms of the flexibility that a provider has to just get the family whatever they need, that there's not there's not a handbook, but that might be the most effective way that a community can intervene with the families that they're serving. So we're also trying to keep our focus on evidence-based practices are not the only answer to preventing placement into foster care. Evidence-based practices are not the only kinds of interventions that reduce abuse and neglect. And we are seeing a lot of communities, particularly rural communities or smaller communities, who have developed programs. And at first, I think we're being nudged by state interest in funding family first funded programs, getting the federal reimbursement sort of pushed towards EBPs that maybe the people in their communities weren't a great fit for, or for whom there were no practitioners. And so I think really making sure that when we talk about prevention, we talk about family first being a part of that, and educating legislators, educating state budget officials, of which I used to be one, that just because there's an entitlement revenue service associated with entitlement revenue funding source associated with a service, it doesn't make that service better than a service that you already know is effective for a particular community.
Yeah. Of these programs, though, I'm curious, what do you hear states saying, damn, when are they going to add this model or this program? When is the clearinghouse going to get to this? Is there one or two that come to mind where states are like, why isn't this here yet?
Honestly, at this stage of the game, I can't think of anything around which there's a lot of consensus. You may have something in mind.
No, I don't. Yeah.
Yeah. At this stage, I think the process for the clearinghouse, I think it's been 2019 was when they approved the first few, has been to request and to prioritize the practices that the states are asking them to review first. And I think the ones that had the loudest and largest groups of people clamoring for a review have probably gotten it by now. And so there's still a lot of practices that are sort of on dock to be reviewed, as I understand, but it's not like it was a few years ago where it was just like a really slow drip.
If I had to go back 5 years, I'm pretty sure I would have guessed that what it looked like in terms of just the big outlay of services that they approved would skew much more towards substance abuse interventions. There are some very significant ones that have been added. I think that START model out of Kentucky, or I guess out of Ohio and really expanded in Kentucky, that's got a lot of promise. I think there's some people that are really energized about that. I think it's like really interesting that the medication assisted, I'm blanking on the name right now. What
the methadone, MMT. Yeah.
MMT, methadone maintenance therapy got added. I don't know how many states have taken that up yet. I'm pretty sure Maine put it on their plan. It's when you look at what is available for people on their prevention plan, there's a lot of adolescent behavioral health interventions, which definitely was not what I think most people viewed as the primary driver of this law when it got passed. We were in the middle of the opioid epidemic, or ongoing opioid epidemic. That was a real wind in the sail of trying to get the people to embrace this and move on it. But it was really parent focused. It was on helping parents. So what do you make of that? I mean, are you surprised at how much of the approved services have been that? I mean, obviously states are asking, to your point, they will prioritize what states wanted. They must be asking for that.
I think so. A couple of things. I think that on the substance use side, in the same year as Family First, later in the year, we got the Support Act. And one of the things that the Support Act did, and I'm not an expert in this, but I think I'm right, is require Medicaid state plans to cover MAT, so medically assisted treatment for opioid use disorder. And prior to that, states did not have to cover that with Medicaid. And it was one of those things when we saw substance use disorder, to talk about Medicaid, when we saw substance use disorder and mental health in Family First to begin with, was really confusing because 4E and Medicaid historically, the feds have worked very hard to say what you can pay for with 4E is not the same as what you can pay for with Medicaid. And we've had all kinds of experiences when those two funding sources overlap, with federal audits and federal reviews really trying to separate those funding sources. And then comes Family First, where it's like all these things that Medicaid can pay for, mental health treatment and substance use disorder under certain waivers, can get funded with 4E. And that was very confusing at first. And the Support Act clarified some of that. We can talk about payer of last resort. But I think some of the substance use disorder investments that were happening from the Medicaid side maybe pulled some of the attention away from substance use disorder and into other treatments.
Okay, so this is working backwards because I do want to talk about payer of last resort stuff with you next. But are you, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying it's likely that were the Support Act not to have become law, we would see a greater emphasis or greater use of 4E prevention services to pay for medication assistance?
I think that's possible. I think, once MAT, medically assisted treatment, which would include methadone treatment, was now covered by Medicaid for Medicaid eligible people, it might have become less urgent on the 4E side to access that. It is still extremely urgent in child welfare to have parents have access to substance use disorder treatment. And I was talking to some folks on my team last week who were saying very much that if you want to prevent placement into foster care for children who are at imminent risk of placement for foster care, substance use disorder treatment is still the number one thing that we need to be paying attention to.
Okay, wait, that's a great segue to this. One rule that the Trump administration officials put into the kind of early guidance here on Family First, as Heather referred to, is this payer of last resort instruction, which is a little complicated, but it's important. We should talk about. States have some mandates as far as what Medicaid will cover. Heather just explained to you that has been augmented to include medication-assisted treatment, but they do also have freedom to go kind of beyond. So what that ends up meaning is that some states have pretty restrictive, small scope Medicaid plans, and some have very generous ones. They can cover people at different incomes. They can do different things, right? So if your state will cover a service that's approved by the Family First Clearinghouse through Medicaid, then Medicaid has to be the payer. Sort of means that states with less inclusive Medicaid plans actually can benefit the most or could benefit for the most from Family First. And, I was reminded of how limiting that might be when I was recently kind of reading through Minnesota's plan. We did a story on, I'll put that in the show notes. The state worked with stakeholders, they worked with the community, maybe they worked with you. We're not talking about our clients. Heather's giving us the broad strokes of her expertise to get this recommended list of what they wanted off the Family First menu. And then they got like 5 and immediately cut 2 because it's payable through Medicaid in Minnesota. So I think one way to look at that is like, okay, no biggie. If Medicaid can pay, we're good. You don't need Family First. I have a thought on why, and I've written about this, like why it's not that simple. But I defer to you as an expert. What in your mind is lost when a state's Medicaid plan precludes inclusion of Family First services?
I think payer of last resort, 4E as the payer of last resort, it was a necessary clarification. It was in the Support Act. It helped us understand how this was going to work, right? Because Medicaid is the payer of last resort otherwise for everything. Right. And that was very confusing. What do we bill? So having that clarification is useful. The impact, though, is exactly as you're describing. For some states, they looked at what was on the clearinghouse and what their populations needed. And a lot of what was on the clearinghouse was already being funded by Medicaid. And states take different approaches to that. One is, as you're describing in Minnesota, to not include Medicaid-funded interventions in their Family First prevention plan. The reason for that is probably just it's complicated and you already have a payer for the service. A lot of states do include those services in their Family First plan. And that gets down to a question of funding. So one of the things that 4E will pay for is for the administration of the Title 4E prevention program. And so if a child is receiving a service that is on their state's approved Family First prevention services plan, but it's being funded by Medicaid, as long as that child is documented as a candidate for foster care, has that service listed in their prevention plan, then the administrative costs of the agency associated with that child's case can be funded with Title 4E. So the case management and all of those other pieces. And so for a state that is able to, one of the good things about that is that in order to do that, you have to know that a child's receiving a Medicaid funded service. And so I think there's an opportunity there for increasing coordination of services between Medicaid and your caseworker and your Title 4 agency, especially where that might not already be happening. And so if Medicaid's paying for the service and the caseworker knows that the family is receiving the service and that's part of their prevention services plan, that requires a level of coordination that I think could benefit the family. And by going through all of those steps, then the state would be able to draw funds to support the administration of the prevention program, which is in a lot of states, the larger price tag that it costs more to do the case management side of managing an open in-home services case than the cost of the service itself. So states are doing it both ways. They are either just not including those Medicaid programs in their prevention plan, or including them and claiming for the administrative costs. And also you can claim for costs associated with that service that aren't covered by the Medicaid rate. So maybe if your Medicaid rate doesn't cover the training of the staff or doesn't support a higher qualified staff, like there are ways that you would be able to say there are these costs associated with the service. We're not claiming them to Medicaid, and so we can cover them with 4E.
Before I was adopted, I felt like my life was already over.
My biggest fear was that I would age out and not know how to be sufficient on my own.
At a certain age, like they don't want you, you're troubled and stuff.
The clock is ticking for the more than 125,000 kids waiting to be adopted from foster care. Help the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption prevent them from aging out without a permanent family. Learn more at davethomasfoundation.org.
Now, let me run by you what I had in mind. And I'm fully prepared for you to say, you're an idiot. That's not an idiot. Okay.
Okay.
But I'm working off memory because I remember writing this column back after the guidance came out about pair of last resort. And I equated what can't be quantified and what you just described is waiting for things. So I think I called it like the fast pass theory, equating this to like when you're at Disney World, you know, you got your kids there. Do you want to wait in line for Space Mountain all day? No, let me just pay for this thing that's going to get me to the front of the lines all the time. And how that relates is if your state covers, even does a good job covering, has a really robust way of covering medication assisted treatment and has a good Medicaid plan for supporting people to beat their addiction or get their substance abuse treatment, right? So somebody goes and needs help, and on Medicaid, they're saying, you know, okay, we'll get you in the next bed that's possible. It's going to be about 4 months. The very definition of what we're talking about with a candidate for foster care imminent risk really suggests that there are not 3 months to wait, right? You can't say these are imminent, urgently needed help to keep a kid from foster care and then say, but go ahead and wait 4 months for it. You need it now. You know, the parent needs it now. Also tied into like motivational interviewing. When's that most likely going to work? In the moment, or great motivational interview leads to, and if you could just hang on for 4 months, you know, you can get in there. So it seems like a big loss that a state who had this Medicaid plan couldn't then have a very dedicated track, beds only for moms and dads who need the help to prevent their family being broken up, have a separate track to make that go faster. That is what seems to me like you can't, I don't know how you factor that into just simply talking about payer of last resort. There are lots of waiting lists in Medicaid. People wait forever to get help. And that's just not feasible, I think, in some of these cases, right?
Yeah, I think the urgency piece is key, you know, that the idea is that in at least some of these cases are the more narrowly defined view of candidacy cases, there's an immediate need for treatment. I think that, so a couple of things. One is that the payer of last resort rule says that you can use 4E, and I think this is what you were referring to. You can use 4E if that gets you access to the service faster. And then Medicaid just has to pay 4E back later. I don't really like practically when I think about like what that means from a claiming perspective and the forms that you fill out and how those transactions occur.
So that, I know that
really
that
sure
exists.
What that means.
Yeah, I know that exists, but is that reality? Like, you deal with states all the time. You just said that we really need better play between child welfare agencies and Medicaid. Is the child welfare agency really going to trust like, oh, don't worry, do this multi-million-dollar thing that we need, and we'll definitely get it back
later. I'm sure there are some states who can make that work. You know, like
Probably,
I think there are some states who would have that sophisticated, way to do those reconciliations between programs. I think what I would question is that it would actually, the payment mechanism, I don't think is what would speed access to treatment. I think what would speed access to treatment would be looking at your prioritization criteria and saying, as you said, if this is a family who needs access to the service in order to prevent placement into foster care, then they get to go to the top of the list. Because I think usually the wait lists are because of capacity, not necessarily availability of funds. And I think definitely when it comes to accessing some of these services for the families that are being served through child welfare, we're seeing, and especially now, we are just seeing capacity problems. The programs don't have enough staff. They have to limit the intake. And so the speed to service might be around revisiting your prioritization criteria and letting people jump the line versus, having who's paying be that accelerator.
Yeah, I guess that seems like what they call a Hobson's choice to me, where you're going to pick somebody somebody's losing. Because
somebody's losing. Yep.
Yeah, because if you're moving everybody in this group to the front of the line, that's great for the child welfare agency. Sucks if your single adult male son is the one that you were trying to get into treatment, right?
That's right.
So
none of the choices are easy, right?
Correct.
And even if it is the case of limited state funding, which can be a limiting factor, none of those choices are easy.
We have talked a lot about the front end proposition of Family First. Let's talk a little bit about the limits on the back end of group care settings. It used to be the case that, this 4E that we've been talking about could flow pretty much without limits. I mean, obviously you'd have to be a kid who was 4E eligible, but, if a state wanted to draw down federal funds for a 4E eligible kid to be in congregate care for 5 years in a row, they could do that. Now the limit is 2 weeks, with some notable exceptions that we will talk about. But let's just talk about the general experience of this, because I'm curious what you hear from states. There was definitely some blame game going on very early, lashing closures of group homes to Family First, like before it had even taken effect in some states, which kind of was honestly laughable, at the time, because we were already in a period where a lot of states were kind of closing it for different reasons. And then you just all of a sudden people were saying, it's this federal law. It's like that federal law hasn't even come into play yet. But the new rules on congregate care have been in place now for almost 2 years, I guess, October 2021. So are you aware of any states that have actually started to close out congregate care space or limit actually attributable to the Family First constraints?
Well, it's hard to say where all of the causal relationships are.
Sure.
What I think that Family First definitely accelerated some states' plans around reforming congregate care. We have seen states experience significant reductions in congregate care placements. Part of the reason that Family First paid attention to congregate care is the growing body of evidence that showed that it wasn't good for most kids, and that it serves a very specific purpose to treat children at very high need, and that those resources should be funneled to very high quality programs for children that really need it. And so I think that research is the foundation of the Qualified Residential Treatment Program requirements in Family First, which is all of those things. It's a 4E allowable placement. It requires an assessment of the child that the level of treatment is necessary. It requires that a judge confirms that that level of treatment is necessary. And it limits the amount of time that the child can stay in that placement and receive Title 4E funding without additional approvals and reviews. And I think that's all very much based on the evidence. The problem, I think, that is rampant in a lot of states and for just communities is having enough places to place the children as they're coming into foster care. And so we solve that problem, in multiple ways. We reduce placements into foster care, right? We offer more prevention services. We expand kinship. And kinship finding and those efforts to place a child somewhere that's not in a formal foster care setting or a non-kinship setting, make investments into expanding the number of foster family homes and the supports that those foster family homes receive, so that you're really narrowing down the number of children who are placed in group care.
Which I would just add quickly that of the things that are tangential to the law and what it hopes to accomplish, that was the part that, let's say it's almost an insulting amount of money was allocated in Family First to recruitment and retention of foster parents, which was always going to play a role. If your hope is to lower the number of congregate care usage, the long-term bet is, well, we'll remove less kids because we're doing these services, but that still leaves you in the short term with a need for something else in foster care, right? And
yes,
there was $8 million for the whole country allocated in Family First to the issue of foster care recruitment and retention. So I do
for those capacity grants, right?
Yeah.
Like to increase capacity.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say, although not far from generous, recruitment and retention of foster families, training of foster families, anything related to the placement of the child, those are all 4E allowable costs. So states can claim for those, but they have to apply discounts for the percent of children who are eligible for 4E and foster care. So it's definitely diluted. Whereas, federal grants are just 100% federally funded. $8 million is nothing to the feds. It's nothing.
There was a bill, this is off the topic of these QRTPs, the Qualified Residential Treatment Programs that Heather was talking about, which, as she correctly described, are meant to be the main exception to the limits. This is, the research has shown us that the only youth who arguably really need some sort of group care are often the ones with the most acute health needs. And so this is a more clinical setting. It's going to guarantee to do a lot of different things. There was a bill introduced last Congress, and maybe the one before it, to exempt these QRTPs from the general limitations of Medicaid, which go back to the 60s and typically forbid Medicaid money to go into institutions. The reason for that back in the day was because we didn't want states to just institutionalize people so they could collect a check and very simply care for them, as opposed to doing the harder work of actually building a mental health, community-based outlay. Now, we're obviously in a different place a little bit than we were when Medicaid was invented. We're certainly 40 or 50 years. I'm terrible at math. It's probably more than that now. What's your sense of that request? And, is this something that like all states want to happen?
I think so. Yeah. So the Institutes for Mental Diseases exclusion, the IMD exclusion, where Medicaid can't pay for services that are provided to someone who's placed in the institution for the sole purpose of the treatment of mental disease, is the exclusion. And at first, there was a great deal of concern that the definition of a qualified residential treatment program, which says a child is being placed in this institutional setting because they have a treatment need, necessarily overlapped with the definition of an institute of mental disease, and so would not be eligible for Medicaid. And that was a very serious concern for several states. And CMS's response to that was, well, it's your Medicaid program's job to review all of those settings and determine whether they are institutes for mental disease. And states took very different approaches to those reviews. We worked with states to look at why are these children placed in these settings? And it's really hard, even, coordinating with medical professionals, reviewing a case history, understanding the assessment that recommended the placement into one of these institutional settings. When you're talking about a child who has been placed into foster care, they have experienced trauma. And the trauma that is associated with their experience of abuse and neglect, combined with the trauma of being removed from their home, makes it really hard for people to discern whether that child's placement in an institutional setting is because of the trauma they've experienced or because they need treatment for a mental disease. We found that to be really confounding, like a really challenging thing to untangle in these particular cases. And every state, I think, had to struggle with that. We had some, and it's for, just to be clear, the IMD exclusion applies to over 16 beds.
Right.
So states are looking at, like, what are these settings that have over 16 beds? Do they meet the criteria of a qualified residential treatment program? And are they IMDs? And going through all of the steps to determine on a case-by-case basis. Some states said, you know what, we don't want to put kids in settings over 16 beds anyway. So we are just going to say they're all IMDs and work to reduce our reliance on those kinds of settings.
So are you aware of any state that has successfully argued to CMS that their QRTPs are qualified under the IMDs?
Are not IMDs? Yeah, definitely. Because there are states that have gone through that process with their Medicaid officials to review on a setting by setting basis and come to that determination. They're like criteria for an IMD, the number of people who are placed in the setting solely to treat a mental disease. There's a set of criteria, and states have come up with tools by which they can review the setting and then determine, yes, this is an IMD, and so it is not eligible for Medicaid funds, or no, this is not an IMD and it is eligible for Medicaid.
And you're saying that some states in this time period, so not before Family First, I know that, for instance, I believe Minnesota had a waiver at some point through their Medicaid waiver to do some of this stuff, but some people so that's sort of the alternative to a legislation that just says all QRTPs are not IMDs and can.
Correct.
Everybody's got to make their case to CMS, and you're saying that some have succeeded.
Some have demonstrated, have determined. And again, CMS, as far as I know, they don't come back and say, prove it to me. They might in an, OIG might come and do an audit, or someone might come and do an audit. They are saying, here's the process. Your Medicaid director, your Medicaid agency has to make this determination. So as long as they've made that determination, like that directs whether or not you can claim Medicaid.
So there is some risk in that. CMS could come to them later and say, no.
Yes. And there have been states that have said, no, prior to Family First, CMS or OIG or, some federal oversight agency came to us and reviewed our facilities and said they are IMDs.
Yeah.
And so we do not claim them to Medicaid. So some states have been through that process and some states haven't.
I guess we'll see. We are way over the normal time for interviews, but I did want to ask you one last thing, because we've talked a lot about the prevention side, a little bit about the congregate care limits. There were other things in this law. There were kind of like smaller pieces, and just want to give you a chance to call out any that you kind of feel like have you jazzed, have states have embraced already or are benefiting from. One that jumped out to me when the law was passed was, they extended the runway for like 4B. It's another federal pot, smaller than 4E, for reunification support, right? So that used to end right when the kid went home. Now it's, months and months and months afterwards that a state can support it. So I said, okay, it's got some upside in changing, our approach. Anything like that, that sticks out? States have been like, oh, this has been pretty good.
I don't know that there's a particular provision of the law that I would point to, but I would say that the conversation that Family First has ignited around your prevention services array. So some of the things I was saying about, yes, evidence-based practices are great. And also other practices that exist in your state that have been developed to meet the needs of a particular community may also deserve state investment and funding. So really looking at the full service array, I think, has been an enormous benefit to states, and really thinking about, what am I buying from community-based agencies that will support families and prevent placement into foster care? How am I measuring whether or not that's effective? I think those are always important conversations. And the other thing I would just say is that another area of family support and stabilization that is not funded by Family First, but probably has the most evidence that it actually prevents abuse and neglect and prevents placement into foster care, are economic supports and services. So what we're seeing around the impact of the child tax credit in reducing abuse and neglect, just research that demonstrates across almost every concrete and economic support, SNAP, TANF, Medicaid, EITC, that just helping families with money, economic supports, is probably our most powerful abuse and neglect prevention tool. That's a conversation that has been really energized over the past several years, not because Family First pays for those things, but I think because it doesn't. And yet those are the things that we know now are likely the most effective.
Heather Baker, Public Consulting Group, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks to Heather Baker of Public Consulting Group for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes the Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voices Rising program. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we'd really appreciate it if you would support our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can always reach us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.